Greetings, horror fans, and welcome back to my phantasmagoria. The dark spark of inspiration that strikes within certain horror authors is usually ignited by eerie circumstances that they themselves have experienced, and then they put it down onto the page. This week we're going to be talking about possibly the most famous of these eerie circumstances, the Year Without a Summer, 1816, specifically in a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva. Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley had a whirlwind romance. Percy Shelley was a very famous, well, he would become very famous, but a famous poet who was married at the time but seemed to be struck down in deep love by this incredibly intelligent, poised, kind 16-year-old. Ew. Their romance was dominated by walks in graveyards and the suicide of Percy's wife, because probably she was thinking, oh God, my husband's abandoning me for a 16-year-old. They eloped together to the continent in 1814 along with one Claire Claremont. They didn't really have a good time. They didn't have a lot of money, and Mary Shelley wasn't a big fan of Claire Claremont, who apparently made the trip kind of unbearable. They went back to England in 1815, where Mary Shelley had her first child, to Percy Shelley, who was born premature and died. This really affected them, and later, just a couple days later, in her journal, Mary Shelley would write, "Dreamt that my little baby came back to life again, that it had only been cold, and we rubbed it before the fire, and it lived." We can clearly see her first kind of seeds of Frankenstein have already been planted here, just as she come back from her first trip to Europe. So the idea was already within her. In 1816, their son William was born. He would die 3.5 years later, but for that brief little period they were happy they had a kid. Just 4 months later they decided to go on another trip to Europe. Don't know why, considering their first trip was kind of a disaster, especially considering 1816 was not the best year for planning holidays. The weather in the summer of 1816 was memorable for the wrong reasons. A volcano near Indonesia had erupted, causing volcanic ash to go up into the atmosphere. The sun was obscured, rainfall levels went up, temperatures went down. It was not exactly a nice summer. This then caused lots of crop failures because there was no sun for the crops to, cause photosynthesis and grow. For people that weren't living in Asia, they had no idea why this was happening, so it was probably quite terrifying. I mean, you had to start lighting candles around noon, and all the birds were roosting around 11 in the morning. It was quite eerie. And also, the same year, scientists discovered dark spots on the sun, so it was kind of an eerie feeling in the year of 1816. This was reflected in Lord Byron's poem Darkness, which he actually wrote at the same during his trip to Geneva in 1816, where he was staying with the Shelleys, if you would allow me to read. Just an extract, not the whole thing, it's quite a long poem. "I had a dream which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and brought no day." The Year Without a Summer, as 1816 became known, basically became the perfect backdrop for morbid stories and the writings of Gothic tales. Within 10 days of the Shelleys and Claremont arriving in Europe, specifically Geneva, Lord Byron would appear in kind of a dramatic fashion. He'd show up in his large, grand Napoleonic carriage, accompanied by his doctor, John Polidori, where they had just come from a sightseeing trip of the battlefield of Waterloo. And they showed up at their hotel at midnight. Suitably dramatic, I suppose, yes. Claremont had become Byron's mistress in the spring and wanted to kind of continue this tryst, so convinced the Shelleys to go with him to Lake Geneva rather than continuing on to Italy, which had been their plan. So we can basically say that Frankenstein, a fragment of a novel by Lord Byron, and The Vampire by John Polidori all exist today because of Claire Claremont's horniness towards Lord Byron. I mean, I've heard he's attractive, but I didn't think it was enough to cause all of Gothic fiction to exist. I guess I have Claire Clairmont to thank for my hobby. The three of them moved right next to Polidori and Byron, and Polidori and Byron lived in the Villa Diodati. I couldn't remember it. I had to read it off of my script. Please don't shoot me. Because the weather in June was particularly bad, they couldn't do any boating trips onto the lake, which was kind of the whole attraction of Lake Geneva. You'd go out on a boat and you'd go boating, you know, like early 19th century rich people did. But because they couldn't do that, they stayed inside, talked about books, talked about literature, and all that sort of thing. They talked as night had fallen hours before, around noon. Clouds and rain came down from the mountains constantly. Thunder rolled down and struck over the lake, causing bright flashes of light. And in this kind of nice atmosphere, aesthetic, if you will, they discussed things like galvanism and animation, which Polidori's actual doctoral knowledge being a big counterweight to Percy Shelley and Lord Byron being a bit more fanciful, which also may have been one of the reasons why Lord Byron eventually didn't get on with Polidori, because Polidori would constantly go, oh no, that wouldn't work because of this, and this, ruining Byron's kind of more imaginative ideas that he had in his head. But I suppose that's what scientists do, tell you the truth. Mary Shelley recalled these, and I'm going to read from her 1831 opening of Frankenstein, which I have here, but I've typed it up so I don't need to go searching for it. I have some bookmarked, but I don't have this extract bookmarked specifically. Many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. During one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others the nature of the principle of life, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered, communicated. Byron was reading out of a book called Phantasmagoria, kind of like what I call this show, but not like it because it has an N. It's a French translation of German stories, and he was reading all of it, horror stories, and he was reading these. But tensions were kind of mounting in the villa. Polidori had a thing for Mary Shelley, which we can clearly see from her how she refers to him. She did not reciprocate, calling him poor Polidori and kind of a moron quite a bit. And of course Claire Clairmont couldn't take her hands off of Lord Byron, and this all kind of created an atmosphere of tension. And this didn't really react well with Percy Shelley's more artistic soul, if you will, and he became kind of manic and morbid. At one point, Byron was reading out a poem, let me double check what it was called, Christabel. It's a poem about a girl that's actually a Lamia, a demon, and apparently he was such a good poetry reader that Percy Shelley basically had a mental breakdown and ran shrieking out of the room. He claimed it was because he saw a visage of a strange demon woman with eyes for nipples. Cool. We will each write a ghost story, Lord Byron suggested. And everyone went, yeah, okay. Byron wrote The Fragment, which I discussed last week, which you should check out and watch because it didn't do as well as some of my other videos. Go watch it. Go watch the Fragment video I made. It's a decent video. Go watch it. Link down below. Percy Shelley tried to write about some of his early life. He fizzled out, just the same as Lord Byron did. Mary Shelley didn't seem to like Polidori's idea, but a better way to illustrate this, rather than just me telling you, is I'll read direct from the source, her 1831 Introduction to Dracula. If you would allow me. I know this probably isn't quite as interesting, but gets you right to the source. The noble author began a tale, a fragment of which he printed at the end of his poem of Metz. Shelley, more apt to embody ideas and sentiments in the radiance of brilliant imagery and in the music of the most melodious verse that adorns our language than to invent the machinery of a story, commenced one founded on the experiences of his early life. Poor Polidori had some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady who was so punished for peeping through a keyhole. What to see, I forget. Something very shocking and wrong, of course, but when she was reduced to a worse condition than the renowned Tom of Coventry, he did not know what to do with her, and was obliged to dispatch her to the tomb of the Capulets, the only place for which she was fitted. The illustrious poets, also annoyed by the platitude of prose, speedily relinquished their uncongenial task. I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to this task. And she couldn't think of one, until she had a form of waking nightmare, which I'll also discuss here. When I placed my head upon my pillow I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling before the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretching out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the Creator of the world. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, that this thing, which had received some imperfect animation, would subside into dead matter, and he might sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench it forever. The transient existence of the horrible, of the hideous corpse, which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains, and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. I opened mine in terror. The idea so possessed my mind that a thrill of fear ran through me, and I wished to exchange the ghastly image of my fancy for the realities around. I see them still, the very room, the dark parquet, the closed shutters with the moonlight struggling through, and the sense I had that the glassy lake and the white high Alps were beyond. So, stories do come in dreams, but without things like Lord Byron's insistence on a ghost story competition, and 1816, The Year Without a Summer, we would not have been able to dredge up these images and ideas that Mary Shelley obviously already had from her journal entries and things like that to the forefront and out onto book form. And we wouldn't have one of the most famous and inspirational pieces of Gothic horror to exist, which I am currently reading. You can see I am this much through it. It's quite good. I like it. It's harder to read than Dracula. It is a lot harder to read. I remember that because I tried to read it before. I read Dracula when I was around 13, and I tried to read Frankenstein, and I couldn't get into it. It is still quite hard to get into. But it's still an amazing book. And you can clearly see that the character of Frankenstein, the doctor, has clearly been brought into so much more fiction. Like in Penny Dreadful, they do a great job of translating his character, and in so much more fiction. Less than Dracula, less inspirational than Dracula, that's for sure. We don't see as many Frankenstein movies as we see Dracula films, but we still get some, like I, Frankenstein, and that shit. Hope you like this somewhat maybe shorter video. I know it's because it's a shorter video week about the Year Without a Summer and the inspirational ghost story competition that was held in the shores of Lake Geneva. Make sure to like some of my other videos, like and watch and subscribe. They might be appearing on the screen soon. You can watch some of them. If you want to learn about The Fragment of a Novel by Lord Byron, I made a video about it last week. You can go watch that. I think I said link in the description. I'll be making videos on Frankenstein when I finished it, and The Vampire when I finish that. Next month is October, and because I recently broke 100 subscribers, I'm going to do basically Dracula month. I'm going to do minimum 4 videos on Dracula. I'm going to do ones about the story itself, the inspiration behind it, some very interesting essay I found that's in my copy of Dracula about how it's primarily a story about invasion, and lots of other things like that. So make sure to tune in, subscribe, and stay tuned for all that stuff coming within the next month.